In 1839, a young man called Henry Parkes arrived in Sydney. He was almost broke, he had a few shillings in his pocket, and he sold some of his clothes, some of his possessions, and he made his way to Regentville, just south of Penrith. In fact, if you're asking someone from Penrith today, they'd say Regentville is almost a central Penrith suburb, to find his first employment with a guy called John Jamieson, one of the wealthiest men in the colony at the time. And I thought a lot about this journey. He spent a little bit of time working as a labourer on John Jamieson's property before making his way back east to find a higher paying and more credible job. And I thought, I've heard this story before. How much has really changed over this period of time? Well, upon reflection coming into this event, and I thought one of the things that the Daily Telegraph has done over the last few years is the evolution of this campaign. It was a fair go for the West, then it became the best of the West, and now we're starting to talk about the future of Western Sydney. And I think that's a reflection of the way Western Sydney is thinking about itself. It's not so much the handout, the poor people from Western Sydney, how can we make them better. There's a sense that Western Sydney is changing. And I think the very nature, in fact the naming of this campaign and what we're gathered for today is a reflection of that. We're now turning our eye to the future. And so I think about the building of something, the building of a house, the building of infrastructure. It starts with a foundation, the absolute need to get the foundations right. And for me, there was a point in time, very, very obvious for me. It was June 2010, the month I got elected to Parliament. Perhaps I was a little bit on the leading edge. Back then, Barry O'Farrell was walking around telling everyone in New South Wales we needed to start the change. Perhaps the people of Penrith sensed that. They voted for a young guy, 29. The average age in Penrith at the time I was elected was 31. Perhaps I looked just like everyone else in Penrith. Perhaps I was talking about things that people in Western Sydney hadn't spoken about. Or perhaps people in Western Sydney were talking about them, just no one else in the East was prepared to listen. And so they voted one of their own in. But if you think about 2011 as a point in time, 10 years after the Sydney Olympics, in my mind, that decade after the Sydney Olympics represented a lost decade. A decade where we didn't invest in infrastructure, where we didn't prepare for the future. We actually had the single best global marketing campaign available to any country right here in our city. We came up with an amazing opportunity to stretch Sydney further west. We took it to Olympic Park. Most people overseas still think the Olympics took place close to the harbour. But we reshaped our city off the back of the Olympics, and then for the next decade we did nothing. In 2011 that changed. And I want to talk about the foundation stone that's been built in the last decade. Because if you really want to understand the direction and the future we are going, you've got to understand the foundation stones at which you're building it on. In 2011 there was no North West Rail Link, a rail link that JJ Bradfield put on a map 100 years ago. And it took us till 2011 to come up with a financial plan and a commitment to actually deliver that. Now people who live in North West Sydney can get on a train. In fact, they can get on a train even when there's a strike. We've also seen investments in road infrastructure. I think about the M4 East. I lost count of how many times the M4 East was going to be started, stopped, started, tunnel, cut and cover, you name it, there was every different version of it. We committed to the concept of WestConnex. We now have the M4 East tunnel. We now have the duplication of the M5 tunnel, which is now called the M8. We're linking those and we'll provide another crossing of Western Sydney, of the Western Harbour. Those things didn't exist in 2011. The idea of committing to an airport in Western Sydney. And I do want to recognise the contribution of the Commonwealth Government. It's their investment, but it was also their decision in 2013. I remember giving a speech in Parliament at a breakfast when I was a Parliamentary Secretary, invited along to be a guest speaker to talk about the future of Western Sydney back in 2013. And I spoke about the need for Western Sydney to have a 24-hour international airport. A journalist came up to me at the end of that and they said, geez, your career's going to be short. No one in Western Sydney wants to support a 24-hour airport. Now we're asking ourselves, why did it take so long? That airport itself has also been at the genesis for a catalytic change in the way we think about Western Sydney. And to the Commonwealth's credit and to the state government, we just didn't build an airport in a paddock. We sensed right from the very beginning that this airport needed to be connected. So sitting alongside $5 billion of investment in an airport is another $4.5 billion in road infrastructure. The travel times now on the Northern Road between Campbelltown and Penrith are halved. The tyranny of distance that has largely remained unchanged from when Henry Parkes first arrived in Regentville in 1839 to where we got to in 2011 were almost exactly the same. Short of the speed and capacity of the car that you're on, but that was negated by the fact that there wasn't a road that allowed you to drive faster. Now people between Penrith and Campbelltown are much closer. So there's a common thread here, and that is that Western Sydney is more connected to Western Sydney than ever before. And when you think about the future of Sydney, another decision that was taken by our government was to create the three cities concept, the metropolis of three cities. And when you think about the central city and the western city, one of the things that was most or least understood, I should say, was the need to actually connect Western Sydney with itself. Because Western Sydney was denied those connections. In fact, it was forced onto the triple M's. The M5 if you're in the southwest, the M4 if you're in my neck of the woods at Penrith, or the M2 if you're in the northwest. And the only place that you could go was to travel along that long motorway into this tiny little space right next to the harbour called Central Sydney. Everything was designed that way. We broke that mould. We reshaped what Western Sydney needed to look like because we knew that for Sydney to be the strongest possible city that it could be in Australia, the single biggest contributor to national GDP, the single biggest contributor to GSP in this state, Western Sydney needed to be more productive. It needed to perform better. And it started with those plans. It started with that infrastructure. And we've continued to lay those foundations. I remember at the last election, because this issue is still contested. It's contested every week and every day. We were accused of putting stadiums before hospitals and schools. Well, here we are in Parramatta. And if you walk just down the road, you can actually stand at a point where on one side of the road there's a new stadium. On the other side of the road there's a new school. Underneath your feet there's a new tunnel that allows you to travel. Around the corner there's a new light rail. And just down the road there's a brand new Westmead Hospital. Premier Berejiklian said in her opening remarks to the 2019 campaign, the citizens can have it all. I think we're going pretty close to demonstrating, particularly here in Parramatta, you probably can, particularly when you've got that long-term vision and commitment. Now, I've been told time and time again over the last 10 years that you can't do that Western Sydney doesn't want it, that Western Sydney won't understand it. It's rubbish. I got told I couldn't build a pedestrian bridge over the Nepean River. Since that bridge was built, there's $150 million of new investments from businesses and governments alike across the Nepean River. We got told that Parramatta wouldn't work for a central business district, and who would want to build office towers there? Well, I'd have to say Lang Walker backed it in, and every other development corporation that didn't back it in is going, geez, we missed that one. So here's a tip for you. Don't miss the opportunity that's coming in Liverpool. Don't miss the opportunity that's coming in Campbelltown. Don't miss the opportunity that's coming in Penrith. They're all coming. They are absolutely all coming. And I love the idea that people will compete for them. But I've also learnt the lesson that vision's got to be backed up with courage. We've had plenty of visions. We've had plenty of plans. But what has changed in the last 10 years is the courage to stick to them, to actually deliver the light rail in Penrith, to actually build WestConnex, to actually stick and build the airport, to make sure that the airport has the connecting infrastructure that it needs. And then there's another challenge that becomes after the capacity to demonstrate your courage to stick to these things, and that's the ability to execute against them. These projects are real. They're not lines on maps. They're not coloured lines with crayons that get rubbed out and redrawn when leaders change. They are real and they have been enduring over the last 10 years. So we have built the most amazing foundation to allow Western Sydney to grow. And this is for Western Sydney. One of the things about the airport, and I even had these questions asked of me just recently. Why are you making the first rail connection from the airport not back to the east? And the first answer was because I don't want people who are landing in Western Sydney Airport to leave Western Sydney. I want them to be able to be connected to the rest of Western Sydney. If Western Sydney was a city in its own right, in another country, another OECD country, 2.5 million people, it'd be the only city in the world that doesn't have an international airport. We've crossed that Rubicon. We've moved beyond it. We've recognised the catalytic nature of it, and we've really started to reshape our entire thinking about the city. So the future is, how do we build on this amazing foundation? How do you take the next step and ensure that Western Sydney has the workforce that is going to be required to drive the future of the economy? And this is where the work that we've done around the Aerotropolis, what we've done around Westmead Health and Education Precinct, really starts to build the next layer on top of this foundation. It's about making sure that if you've got access to a high quality education, that you get access to a high quality job. I've got no doubt in my mind, that we are moving into an era where capital follows talent, not talent following capital. So we need to invest more than ever in our people. We need to make sure that there are places for jobs before there are places for homes. And we need to give business the confidence to understand that they can invest over the long term and know that they will have a citizenship and a government and a business and an industry that will back them in over the long term. We're going to have to break some moulds. We're going to have to think differently about the way we deliver education. The concept of stackable micro-credentials will become something that we see a lot more of. And I know Jennifer will touch on this in her remarks. We've got to think differently about the way we think about amenity. One of the other hallmarks of this government over the last 10 years is the capacity to recycle infrastructure to create new infrastructure. I saw in those opening remarks about Western Sydney, and indeed Sydney, being more than bridges, roads, train lines. Well, we agree with you. That's why we've created Westinvest, where we're going to recycle the capital, the value that we've generated out of WestConnex, and invest that in public amenity, invest that in open parks, invest that in new education offerings, invest it in sports grounds, in arts and cultural facilities. Because we've reached a point in time where the investments that the citizens of Western Sydney have made in their own infrastructure now need to be reinvested back in the people of Western Sydney. And that's exactly what the $5 billion Westinvest Fund will do. We're already thinking about what the future of Western Sydney needs to look like. We're already thinking about the challenges that will exist across Western Sydney. The need to rethink the urban typology, to put people back into smaller homes, closer together, with more public amenity. Because what we don't want to be able to do is repeat the same mistakes that have been made in generations gone by. The idea of dormitory suburbs on the end of long motorways, long distances, long travel times away from where great jobs are. Sydney will not be a successful city if all the people live in the west and all the jobs are in the east. You need a balanced city where great people and great jobs are all in Western Sydney. The foundation, ladies and gentlemen, is exceptionally strong. You can see it in the infrastructure that's been built over the last 10 years. There's now an energy that exists across Western Sydney. And one of the things that I see on a daily basis is young people across Western Sydney, young entrepreneurs in the hospitality sector, in the construction sector, in the service sector, taking the revenues and the profits from their own businesses and reinvesting them back in Western Sydney. Now, this is a game changer because it's a demonstration of confidence. It's a confidence that Western Sydney has in itself, that it's not going to sit idly by, it's going to design and shape its own future. So the question for everyone else is, do you want to get on board? Do you want to follow the lead that is being shown by you by people right across Western Sydney, or do you want to entrench yourself in the same city and the same thinking that existed when Henry Parkes arrived in 1839? Here's a message for you. Western Sydney, it's ready for liftoff. It's time to take off. It's time for everyone to get on board. Have a great day.